here. Jonathan Swift created literary masterpieces. Tell me about the impulse behind this remarkable transformation of Dublin in the 18th century.
Well, it's the usual forces, money and power, because the country was beginning to boom at that point. We had an independent parliament in College Green, and the great families, because the parliament was here and because the commercial capital of Ireland was here, they would have their houses in streets like this, even though their estates might be in the countryside. So they would come up, stay in their townhouses, attend Parliament, have balls in Dublin Castle, and design their new houses.
In 1741, the composer George Frederick Handel was invited to Dublin after being asked to compose a special work in aid of the city's sick. The result was one of the most famous pieces in the entire canon of classical music, The Messiah. This arch is all that remains of Neil's Music Hall, where Handel's Messiah was first performed on the 13th of April, 1742. So great was the demand for tickets that gentlemen were told to come without their swords and ladies without their hoops, so that there might be more room for all. Handel was delighted with the quality of the Dublin voices in his choir and with the response of the audience, drawn, as he put it, from persons of distinction of this generous nation. For the ascendancy, it must have seemed an affirmation of status. After this, how could condescending English visitors dismiss them as mere provincials? But Handel was alert to another music. As he walked the streets of Dublin, he heard the tunes of itinerant Irish musicians. He even transcribed one of them, a melancholy air called The Poor Irish Boy. It was music far removed from the Georgian salons of Ireland. It evoked a country where the material prosperity of the ascendancy simply never reached. Between 1739 and 1741, famine and disease killed up to 400,000 people. The Gaelic poets and the musicians who had once served the Catholic nobility evoked a world in turmoil. When I listen to the songs of this period and examine the preoccupations, the political preoccupations of people, what you get again and again is a sense of a society that feels it's been disinherited.
Well, they were disinherited for a start off, that's the first thing. And secondly, it would be very unusual with such a vast disinheritance not to have that emotionally actually coming through. There's also another strange, interesting, very, very special tradition which speaks even more, I think, of the psyche of the moment of the 17th and 18th centuries, and that's the music of the harpers. With the collapse of Gaelic society, aristocratic society, you have these itinerant harpers, these nomadic harpers.
So the world that paid for them, that sustained them, is gone.
So they had to look for patronage, and of course they logically looked to the new landowners of the big houses, the Anglo-Irish owners of the big houses. So the key person in that is Thorlogh O'Carolan, who was born in 1670, died in 1735. And he was right in the middle of that period, and he was by far the most famous. Now, he's in between worlds, you see, and that's why he's interesting. Because if you listen into Carolan, you can hear the Gaelic aristocratic past. You can hear the hidden Ireland present. And you can also hear the world of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy all in there.
From the early 18th century, restrictions on Catholics had been strengthened under the so-called penal laws, a charter for the defence of Protestant power.
The main aim of the penal laws was to ensure that Catholics would never get back into a position where they would have power over the Protestants and take revenge, which had happened in the 17th century.
Good evening, everyone. And indeed, you're all very welcome to this sacred place, the Mass Rock in Tom Haggard, County Wexford.
But religious oppression only served to make the Catholic priesthood more powerful in rural Ireland. Under the penal laws, Catholics were banned from Parliament and public office.
Back then,
they were barred from voting and from running schools.
Here at Mass Rocks, just like this one behind me.
But Catholic worship itself was never banned. In fact, as the 18th century progressed, the Catholic Church grew in strength. A great seminary was built with government funding here at Maynooth in County Kildare. It would become the largest seminary in the world. The true significance of the penal laws was not religious, but economic. Catholics were not allowed to buy land. And if an existing Catholic landowner died, his property had to be divided among all his children, and that would ensure that no big landowner would survive. A handful of the Catholic elite had held on to their estates, but the majority of rural Catholics became tenants of Protestant landlords. Among some of these, wrote the English traveller Arthur Young, there was a habit of tyranny. It's easy to imagine Ascendancy Ireland as a country with one rigid divide: Catholic poor and Protestant overlords. But within those terms, Catholic and Protestant, there existed many different aspirations. There was an emerging Catholic middle class. People like the young lawyer Daniel O'Connell, whose family had held on to its lands, and who would later become a leading figure in the story of Ireland. Others were the children of merchants and traders, like Thomas Moore, the son of a Dublin grocer who would become the most popular poet of his day.
Ascendancy Ireland couldn't live in a bubble, sealed apart from this large, active, vibrant Catholic culture all around you. There were transactions between Protestants and Catholics on all sorts of levels. There was far more of a coming and going, and far more of complexity to Irish society in the 18th century than has often been allowed by historians.
Protestant Ireland, too, was a varied landscape, not all grandee landlords. In Ulster, Presbyterians were also victims of the penal laws. There, Calvinism was condemned by the established Anglican Church. And like Catholics, they were forced to pay for the upkeep of Anglican ministers. Discrimination prompted many to look beyond Irish shores. Ireland was now part of a rapidly expanding British Empire, and that colonial expansion offered space for those wanting to escape poverty and persecution. At Belfast docks and the other Ulster ports begins one of the great themes of the story of Ireland: emigration. We're used to the idea of Irish emigration to the United States being a Catholic phenomenon. But the first people to come here in any sizable numbers were Ulster Presbyterians. Between 1717 and 1776, more than 250,000 of them crossed the Atlantic to the New World. From the port of Philadelphia, they travelled hundreds of miles west and south along an old Indian trail that became known as the Great Wagon Road. many came to the frontiers of the new America, Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. This is the oldest Presbyterian church still standing in Virginia. Founded in 1740, many of the congregation can trace their ancestry back to the first wave of Ulster Scots who settled in this area. What kind of character do they bring to this place?
Oh, I think they were a very sturdy, independent people. They had already made a transition from one country to another when they moved from Scotland to Ireland, and so they were perfectly willing to cross an ocean. It takes a certain amount of endurance, of courage, of faith, of forward-looking. They're good qualities for pioneers to have.
Some of these Ulster Scots settlers become what are known as the hillbillies. They head for the mountains.
Well, the people that came to be known as hillbillies were the people who lived somewhat on the fringe of the Scotch-Irish community, who moved up into the hills and the hollers in more remote areas. They got a reputation for being kind of a lawless bunch who were outside the mainstream. They were often associated with moonshine.
The Ulster Presbyterians had arrived in a dynamic environment. The borders of America were continually expanding. There was also a growing sense that Americans should govern themselves and not be beholden to a foreign king. In 1775, Americans rebelled against the rule of King George III. The Ulster Presbyterians joined the American War of Independence. To what extent was freedom of religious expression a crucial part of their decision to join the revolution?
I think it was an important contributing factor. The whole opportunity that the Constitution offered with the Bill of Rights to have freedom of religion was something they wholeheartedly supported.
In 1780, Ulster Scots militiamen played an important role on the American side in a famous victory. At the Battle of King's Mountain, they helped to defeat a larger force loyal to the Crown. An eyewitness account of the battle was published in the Belfast newsletter. It also printed personal letters from relatives in America. In one such letter, a young woman writes, "You will undoubtedly laugh at me when I assure you I often wish to be a man. With what pleasure would I take up arms with my brave countrymen, and like them glory in fighting for my liberty." By 1783, the American revolutionaries had finally defeated the British and won independence. The American colonists have proved that Britain is not invincible. And that message will have a powerful impact in Ireland, inspiring a cross-section of opinion, Catholic and Protestant, radical and moderate. All of them questioning ever more loudly how Britain governs their country. In Ireland, it will be a period of reform and fear. Protestant volunteer groups are formed, loyal to the Crown, but demanding more power for the Ascendancy Parliament and a greater Irish share of imperial trade. A committee of influential Catholics, supported by reformist Protestants, succeeds in gaining voting rights. But British government can